All right, so we are talking about Chapter 31, React Part 3. So let's take a look at the topics. I'll start first talking about DOM events and handlers. You know how to do this with vanilla JavaScript. Now you're going to learn the syntax for doing it with React. Then I'll talk about some concepts that are important for just understanding how React works, like the virtual DOM and state, life cycles, and hooks. And then I'm going to introduce two hooks in particular. The useState hook is how we manage state variables, and I'll talk about this concept of lifting state. And then I'm going to talk about useEffect, which is an important hook for doing things like fetching data and waiting to load your page until the data has arrived from some API off somewhere. So I will show you all of these things. Let's start at the very top with DOM events and handlers. So if you want to detect and handle DOM events as they happen, you want to use a camel case JSX attribute instead of all lowercase. So with vanilla JavaScript, if you were putting a handler like in the script tags in the HTML document, you would have put like onClick, like all lowercase. For React, you want to make sure it's camel case. And then the value of that needs to be a reference to a function, but you don't want to actually call it because you're just it's just like when you do an add event listener, right? You say, here's the event that I want you to listen for, and here's the function you should run when the event is, detected. So you're not actually calling the function right there. You're saying, this is just hold on to this. This is the one I want you to run. So an example of what this might look like here is that you would have a handler with code to be executed, something like this. And you typically would have common convention of naming it something like handle click or handle change. That's what most people do. And you can just keep it very straightforward. And if you have multiple handlers for multiple click events in the same file, you just want to be a little bit more specific. But if you only have one, handle click will do. So let's say in this example, I'm just testing to make sure this works. And I have some sort of button. I put onClick attribute, and then that's the actual name of the event, but with the correct syntax for JSX. And then I give it the name of the handler. So without calling it, I just reference it. And then of course that is the handler that is right up there at the top. Okay. And that's it. And then in this case, I'm just console logging something just to prove that it works, right? But obviously you'd probably be doing something else within your handler. So let's go ahead and just practice what this would look like if we wanted to just do it for available plants. You may remember that we have an available plant. So we're picking up where we left off in the last lecture. And we had these buttons that we put in, right? These icons. I just realized I should get this up and running. So let's do that. See, I'm in the correct directory. Yes. npm run dev. All right, let's actually get this up in the browser so we can take a look at it. Cool. Okay. Right. So we have these buttons here, and right now when we click on them, nothing is happening. So what if we wanted to activate that, actually make it possible to detect those clicks from the browser and then execute some code when that happens? We can come to these icons here, add another line, and say onClick equals, and then I'm going to name this one handle. Let's see, this is the one that's for removing a plant, so handle remove plant. And then for this one, I could add an onClick handler called handle allocate plant. How's that? Okay. Why don't we call this return plant? So the concept here is that we've got some bulbs and we're deciding whether we're going to allocate them to a flower bed or not, right? So we either allocate them or we say, nope, I don't want to use that one after all, I'm going to save it. So we return it. We need to define these, right? These are the names. Let's go up here and actually define them. So I might set them up here as consts, say handle return plant, and we will set up a little arrow function here. This is pretty much common practice, is to use anonymous arrow functions for things like this. And I will, for now, just go ahead and put in a console log just so we can test that it's working and say, I clicked the button to return a plant to inventory. How's that? Okay. And then we can do the same thing for allocating the opposite direction. And let me get this out of there. There we go. Okay. And I clicked the button to allocate a plant, and we'll say to a flower bed. Okay. So now that we have these in place, and we're listening for them here by adding them to these icons, we should be able to go over here. And if I open up DevTools and go to our console, let me clear this. As I click on these buttons, I clicked on the allocate button for the blue hyacinth, and it says I clicked the button to allocate a plant. And if I click the other one, I clicked the button to return a plant. So clearly we've proven that it's working. And this is typically what you want to do, is just really quick, just prove that it's working before you actually add the code of the things you want it to do. And we could, continue with this to say, if I return a plant, maybe I need to actually be able to, decrease the number that are available here and increase the number that are allocated over here. But we're not really ready to wire all that up yet. It's going to require some extra knowledge, and we're going to have to actually have some state variables in place. But this is the concept. This is typically, how you're going to set this up with the basic syntax. We are ultimately going to move the handlers up one level, and I will explain that when we get to it. Okay. So there's one more thing to talk about here that we're going to need in a little bit. Because you can't call the handler function directly from the JSX, because that, attribute is expecting a definition or a reference to a definition. If you need to pass in some sort of parameter so that you can specify some sort of piece of data, then you need to define an anonymous function in place to call it. And that way you're still giving it a definition. So that looks something like this. You have your onClick attribute, right? And you say, okay, I can't call handle_click and pass in the word spin here to say which button it was that I clicked, or blink. I need to actually give it a definition. So that's the name of the handler, definitely the one that I want to run, but I need a definition for that parameter when I pass in the argument. So instead, I'm going to give it an anonymous function and have that anonymous function definition be what I say, okay, go run this function whenever you detect a click. And then inside that function, it actually calls the function and passes in the parameter. So this is a common thing that you'll see from time to time, and we are going to need to do it this way so that we can specify which plant it is that we're supposed to be changing the values on for allocating or returning the number of plants that have been allocated to the flower bed. So hang on to this. I wanted to make sure to clarify it. When I was new at doing this, I was a little confused by this at first. So I wanted to make sure to cover it just so you understand the distinction here. And then when we get there later, you'll see me put it into action in our garden planning tool application. So let's go ahead and talk about some of these larger concepts with React. It has a concept called the virtual DOM. And it's a hidden layer where it makes very small partial updates to a copy of the DOM. And this is why React is very fast. It's much faster than some things that had come before it for front-end frameworks and libraries. And it's because of the way that it handles this. So let me explain this process. First, the user interacts with the page and some sort of event is triggered, right? And if a value changes that requires an update to the page, first, React is actually going to make the change in the virtual DOM. And then it will reconcile the actual DOM to match without having to re-render the entire page, which, you can imagine if you don't have to, render every single thing on the page, it's going to be a lot faster if you're just making that partial change. And then also, one of the cool things about it is that because it does this in a step-by-step process when you've got somebody making a lot of changes, maybe they're hovering over multiple things or clicking things very fast, or other events are firing super quickly, several per second, it actually will bundle those together in the virtual DOM before it makes a single update to the DOM. And so that act of bundling allows it to be very efficient in the way that it's making those updates, so that the rendering actually is only happening a few times, even if you have, dozens of changes happening with each one of those. So this is the process. This is how React works behind the scenes to make these changes. And one of the most important things about this, I mentioned here that if a value changes that requires an update to the page, that is where the concept of state comes in. So let's talk about what state means. Regular variables in React do not trigger a re-render if their values change, just regular variables. Instead, you have to have this concept called state. That allows us to have some special syntax for certain variables that will trigger a re-render if their values change in a way that affects what the users are going to see. It doesn't mean that it's going to re-render every single time. It's going to check and see if it needs to re-render, but it's only going to do that with state variables, not with regular variables. So you have to distinguish between the two. And in order to do that, you'll use some special syntax. I'm going to unpack that syntax a few slides from now, but I just want to talk about the concept of it first. But it is going to look something like this with a special syntax. A normal variable, you have some sort of items where you would just set it equal to an empty array and then maybe start adding things to the items, right? No matter how many times that changes, this alone will not trigger a re-render of the page. We have to set up a special state variable instead, and it's going to look something like this. And if you have items set as a state variable instead of a regular variable, that is when it will actually trigger that re-render, or at least evaluate if it needs to trigger the re-render every time the value changes. So again, I'll unpack this syntax for you in a minute. But let's talk about one more thing about state, which is the idea of having an initial state when the component first loads versus the current state every time it changes. So the very first time a page loads, which is called, or if the user refreshes, every single component on the page gets loaded, which is called mounting, in an initial state, which is whatever values you give it to start off with. And as this user continues to interact with the page, if those state variables are updated, you now have a current state that's new and different. And all of this happens as part of something we call a life cycle. And I'm going to look at that in depth here. So I would say don't be overwhelmed by this diagram that I'm about to show you, because I'm going to talk about it little bit by bit. And you don't need to memorize it. I just want, sometimes people find this helpful to see this kind of diagrammed out. It certainly helped me. So I just want to kind of go over this for just a minute so that you understand how React is working behind the scenes as it's mounting and updating and unmounting components. So yeah, don't worry too much about the tiny details here. The overall concept is that mounting is when it actually takes the JSX and it adds it to the DOM, the whole component, for the first time. Every time something triggers an update, you will have things happening, in this column here. And that's, only happens if those components elements are part of the DOM. If it's unmounted, which is when the entire thing is removed from the DOM, then it's just not even there at all. And so it's no longer going to be checking for updates or anything. So here you might have the component initially mount, and it's running some things behind the scenes. It will, use any sort of props that might have been passed in or other initial values that you're giving it to render the page. So it goes straight to a rendering here. And then it updates the DOM and the component has been mounted and the user sees what you intend for them to see the very first time. Anytime you have new props passed in, or you set the value of a state variable to something new, anytime those two things happen, it's going to evaluate, should I update the component? And maybe it matters and maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't actually require anything new to be displayed on the page, then it just skips it. That's the little red X right there. Otherwise, it does a re-render. And so it gets a snapshot before it updates, and then it actually updates the real DOM out of the virtual DOM. And so that is, the cycle here, the life cycle of updating. The other thing over here, it says force update. That's not something you're going to probably run into a whole lot as a beginner, especially. So don't worry too much about that. But that would just be like, we're going to force it to render no matter what. But typically you're going to be dealing with just, new values of props and state variables, potentially needing, requiring some sort of re-rendering. And then if you, just remove the component altogether because it no longer needs to be there, it's just going to be unmounted and it won't be checking for anything anymore. Okay, just on those concepts, does anybody have any questions?
Not looking that way.
Okay. All right. So I want to start talking about hooks. That's the next concept to talk about. And this is where we're going to be able to learn about how to manage state in our application. So hooks were something that were not introduced until React 16.8. Prior to that, React was based in class components, right? We talked about that in part 1. But because functional components are now the direction that React has been heading, they introduced this idea of hooks. They are pre-existing functions that take care of some really handy functionality for you. And all you have to do is tap into them. It's pretty cool. That's why they call it a hook. You're hooking into the life cycles that I showed you in that diagram at different points. So we're going to focus on 2 of them today. One of them's in your book, one of them's not. Use state is how you manage state variables, and that makes sure that the virtual DOM and the actual DOM in the browser can be reconciled, and it can trigger re-renders whenever necessary. The second one is use effect. This is the one that allows you to listen for changes in state and then execute extra code, because React will automatically detect changes in state and trigger that re-render, right? No problem. But maybe you want something else to happen. Maybe you actually need to execute some code to do something for you only when a state changes. That's where use effect comes in, and it can allow you to put some extra code to be executed when that happens. So I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to use that, and one of them is very important for being able to fetch data and make sure your page doesn't load without the data too quickly. You can control that. And we'll use state in conjunction with this use effect hook to make that happen. So don't worry too much about use effect. We'll do that after the break. For right now, we've got plenty we can do just with looking at state. Okay, so I want to talk about the use state hook. This thing accomplishes 3 different things for you when you hook into the lifecycle with use state. You declare a state variable, which, as I mentioned before, means that React will pay attention to it to see if it needs to trigger a re-render. You declare a setter. So this is a function that will set that new value for you. And you don't want to set it directly with an assignment operator like the equal sign. You want to use the setter instead. So both of those things get established when you create this, this state variable. And then it also allows you to pass in the initial state of the variable so that it has a value to begin with, even though later you might use that setter to update the value. So 3 things: state variable, setter, and initial state. And this is what the syntax is doing here. It's using destructuring because use state actually returns an array of 2 elements. So we can go into that array and give them names. So here's a couple of examples. Let's say we have a quote, and this quote can be updated. And we definitely want the page to be updated anytime the quote is updated. So we'll establish a state variable by calling use state here, and we'll destructure the array that's returned and apply names to the both of those elements. The first one is the state variable itself. The second one is the setter. It is common to have the syntax be that you just put the word set in front of whatever the name of the variable is and do it in camel case. And that you always can recognize that those 2 things go together when you do it this way: quote, set quote, author, set author. And then those things will be tracked. And React will pay attention to them. So use state here, the argument here that you're passing in is just the initial value of that state variable. So I want to say initially, both of those just need to be empty quotes until we're ready to actually provide real values for those. We'll just have an empty string for each of them. So there you go. State variable, the setter, and the initial state, the three parts that you need to create the state variables with the use state hook. All right, let's do this in one place. I've got a whole series of to-dos here that we're going to do. That's not what I want. Here we go. And I have narrowed it down just to things in this particular application. So if we go to to-do number 1, you can see that right now we have been using this test plants data, and we have just had it kind of hard coded in here, an array of 3 different objects, just so we could test out everything we've done to build our application so far. And that's a perfectly normal thing to do as a developer. Instead of going and tapping into the API initially. You don't usually do it right away. You use test data like this, so that's fine. Ultimately, though, if we're going to be fetching data from an API, that means it could potentially update, and we want that to be stored in a state variable and not just in a plain JavaScript variable like this. So let's create a state variable that will hold these plants, and we're just going to give it the value of the test plants for now until we're ready to fetch real data from a URL that I'm going to provide. So I'm going to call this all plants. So I need to destructure from the use state hook and call it all plants. And that means my setter is going to be called set all plants, just like that. Okay. And then I can use state. And notice that as I start to type it in, VS Code is saying, hey, I recognize that. It comes from React, from the React library. So I can tab over here, and then if we come up to the top, we'll see that it's added it here, and it's actually destructuring it from the library so that we're not importing the entire React library, which would be massive. We're just importing what we need, use state for now. So then I continue, I put my parentheses, and I give it the initial value. And I said that I wanted that to be test plants for now, just because that's the only data that we have to work with. And so we're just going to do that. So that'll work. And then, of course, we would want down here to say that, we were, going to map over all plants instead of test plants. I'm going to wait to change that until we actually start working with this a little bit more. But for now, you can see that, this is the basic way that you would do this to make sure you've got a variable you can work with that React is paying attention to, so that anytime this updates, it can update the page. And that will mean, anytime any of these objects are updated, we're going to, this will be updated and it will re-render the page accordingly. So there's a lot of power in having a state variable because as we work with this kind of object by object with multiple plants, and let me show you what this data looks like, by the way. An easy way that you can set up a little API for yourself with some JSON is to throw it in a Google Doc of all things. And then there's actually a link that you can build using the ID of this document to fetch it. So it's pretty cool. So I'm actually just going to fetch from this, this JSON from this Google Doc, and that's how we're going to work with all this real data and fetch it when the time comes. But we'll do that after the break. So let's talk about how you would manage state if you were working with user input in a form, which is something else that we're going to do over in our app. You remember we have this title here when we just kind of set it to a hard-coded value of my flower bed, right? What if we wanted to make this editable? We want to say, let's name what the flower bed is. We could make it possible to, click something here and say, I want to edit this, and then save it, and then have it, update the way this looks with the new name. We can totally do that using state. So you would utilize the useState hook, create the state variable in the setter, pass in that initial value, And then we'd want a handler function that captures the event, and we can access event.target.value to get at whatever it is that the user is typing in. And then you can use the setter that you established with the hook to update that state variable. So it looks a little bit like this. And in the JSX for the input down here, you want to bind the value to that state variable so that it updates in both directions. And then just put that handler on, right? And in this case, I'm going to make it possible. I'm going to use the change event so that it will let me update it all at once. So let me kind of go back over this part by part. First, you have your state variable, quote. And so then you have the setter. And then you have, I'm passing in this initial value of an empty string, right? So we start with this handler definition here and say, I want you to grab onto that event, capture the event, and then use the setter that was defined up here to give it whatever value the user has typed in, event.target.value from that input down here. And then we set that handler right here on the input with the onChange attribute. And then it will capture that user input. Okay. So that sounds good. Good. You're kind of like, okay, I think I get this. It's easier if you see it in action, right? So let's go over and do this. We're actually going to make this happen. So I'm going to start here in the flower bed component, which is, this entire thing right here in the right column, right? And we're going to make this thing, make it possible to actually open a form for editing a name. So we need to add a button for one thing. So I'm going to put a button right here. And we'll just have, yep, button. And I'll put an on-click handler on it. And I'm just going to call the button save. And we'll close that out. And then in here, we will have the name of our handler once we define it. And actually, this is the wrong one. Sorry. I want to edit. That's the button that I want for the actual flower bed name here. And then here we can add another section where we're actually going to have the form. And I'm building this piece by piece, so bear with me. There's a lot more in the solution than what I'm actually putting in. So let's do the form. We'll have the input, and we're going to need to bind that to our state variable, which we haven't created yet. And we'll use on input here. This is actually, instead of doing it all at once like you would with on change, I'm going to do on input so that it actually does it character by character as the person is typing in. And so we will bind that to another handler. And then we'll have a button to close the form and save the value. Handle, close form. And really, it's actually going to be, save is a little bit of a misnomer here because we're actually updating it like character by character, but it will close the form. Okay. So yeah, we'll call this one handle close form. We're going to call this one flower bed name. We'll call this one handle name input. So again, I'm using this convention of putting the word handle in front of what it is I'm specifically handling. And that's very common, but it keeps them all straight. Handle open form. So handle open form, handle close form, and handle name input. 3 different handlers that we need to define. So let's come up here and declare our state variables, and then also create our handlers. There's one more state variable that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's this idea that we need to keep track of when we want to display the form and when we don't. So we talked in the last lecture about conditional rendering, right? And we can use a little bit of logic to decide whether the form should be displayed or not. So we can do that with a Boolean that we're going to establish here. So we actually need two state variables where React is going to pay attention to the values of these. And if they change, it's going to check and see if it needs to re-render. So one will be flower bed name. And so I'll have set flower bed name as the setter. And I'll go get use state and say, I want to call this my flower bed. Okay. I'm going to create a second one called editing as a Boolean. We're either editing or we're not editing, true or false. Set editing will be the setter. And then I'll use state again, and we'll give it a default value of false. We don't want the form to be there until the user asks for it. So we want it to be false, and that way it won't actually display this form unless we're ready for it. So in this case, it's just a matter of we either display it or we don't. So we don't need to use a ternary. We need to use a double ampersand. So I'm going to say, if editing is true, display the form. And we just do it as simple as that inside one of those JSX placeholders so it can evaluate this entire thing as an expression. So if editing is true, we will display the form. If it's not, it'll just display absolutely nothing. Okay. So we have these done. Let's create our handlers. We had 3 handlers we need to do. The first one is for updating the flower bed name. And so we will say when we are ready to actually update this value for the state variable flower bed name, we're going to use this handler, handle name input. I'm going to capture the event as the parameter there, which is automatically provided by the browser. And we'll say set the flower bed name to event.target.value. Whatever value the browser currently has as the user is typing in, we're going to grab that off of the event and use our setter that we established up here to change the value of flower bed name for us. Okay, so that handler will work for that. Now we need handlers for opening and closing the form. So we said we were calling these handle open form. And we don't need to capture anything here, have any sort of parameter. So I'm just going to keep that empty. And then we'll say set editing should be set to true. Yeah, set editing to true. If we're closing the form, on the other hand, handle close form, we do need the event. And the reason for that is because, as you learned for the stuff you were working on for graded assignment 5, if you close hit a submit button in a form, what happens? The page tries to refresh, right? The browser automatically tries to do that. So we want to prevent the default here so that it won't refresh the page. And then we can set editing to false, and that will cause this form to disappear because it's going to reevaluate this. And this is important. Again, the whole concept here is that editing is a state variable, therefore React is paying attention. So it will re-render this expression because editing is a state variable. If editing was not a state variable, it would not care and it wouldn't actually, do anything. So fortunately, we planned ahead and made it a state variable, so it will. Okay, let's see. Last couple of things here. Yeah, we did that part. Okay, so let's go ahead and test and see how this works. We just made a lot of changes, but they were kind of all necessary to make in conjunction with one another to work. So let's come over here and take a look at this. You see now we have an edit button next to the name. If I click on this, the form appears. And if we go over here and take a look at these elements, let's use the inspector to actually narrow in on this form here. There we go. When I save this, that form completely disappears from the DOM. When I go to edit again, it adds it back. So it literally, it removes it completely. It's not just that it's hidden, it's removed. So you can see that that handler is definitely working, those two handlers to open and close the form. Now let's see how it works when we want to edit this. And also take note of how it already populated this with my flower bed with the current value. That's because we actually had initially set it to that value. And down here on the input itself, we set the value to be flower bed name and bound it with it. So that essentially says whatever the value is, we want that to be what it shows um, when when you're done, typing, and it's just going to provide it. If you close the form and open it back up again and it adds the form again for the first time, it's going to go look at that state variable, because remember, it doesn't exist when it's not there, right? So then it goes and creates it again, and it just says, okay, let's go get whatever that flower bed name is, and that's what the value will be. And that's really handy because it means that you could save it and then exit out of it and then go back and edit it again, and it's exactly where you left off. So this type of binding here is a really good practice just for the user to not have to start over and type something else in. Okay, so let's see it in practice. I can come over here and say, this is my bed that's under the redbud tree. Okay, and it's not updating. And does anyone know why? I can tell you exactly why. It has to do with this. We have not actually put our variable in here, have we? It's still hard-coded. So let's go and actually use a little placeholder here and put the name of our state variable, flower bed name. And now we see it under redbud tree. And if I come back in and out of this form, you see that it's where I left it off. And maybe I say, oh, that isn't the bed I wanted. I want the one that's, east of the front porch. And as I'm typing it in, you can see that it's updating it because I did the on input event instead of on change. On change would require you to go out of focus, like over here, and then it would update the whole thing all at once. But with on input, you actually can see it doing it character by character, which is pretty nice. We'll save it, and there it is. Okay, so that's how state variables work and how it is that React is paying attention and making updates on the page based on those, two variables specifically, because we designated them as state variables. Okay. So I want to talk about this concept of lifting state. This is an important concept because you can end up with a lot of different components where you might be working in each one of them individually. And maybe it would be easier to actually work with the data at a higher level and then just pass it down through props. That is the concept. So you remember with your studio that assignment that you did for chapter 30, that they had you bringing the recipe data in every single one of the child components, right? So an approach that would probably be taken by a professional that has been doing this for a while would be to actually bring that recipe data in the parent component, which for that particular application was the app component, and then just pass some things down by props. And that's one of the things I showed you in my studio review video in the second solution, was how to take that approach so that you could see it, how it's done both ways. So the only thing about this idea of having, your data up at the parent level and passing it down to the child is that if you start getting a really complex structure with tons of components, and you have children of children of children, great grandbabies of your parent component, this is called prop drilling, where maybe you're sending stuff down props, through props over and over and over again, all the way down. It's actually not a good practice. And so React has something that's a little bit more advanced called use context that you would do instead, to just keep track of that outside the components altogether, but where they can all access it when it's needed because it's being stored in context. They've recently made some massive changes to React, and I mean so recently that I haven't had a chance to check it out yet. But one of the things they did was to even improve how this context thing works. If you really love working with React and you think it's something you'd like to do in the future, I definitely encourage you to check out some of the courses that are out there. I know the IAs put in the free code camp course, and they put that in Discord for you. Another one is Max Schwarzmueller's course on Udemy for React. It's very comprehensive, but it's not something you're going to have time to do anytime soon. So wait until after you get out of this entire thing and you graduate, and then maybe you could go do it. But if you're really interested, you could start to learn some of these more advanced hooks and concepts, and really learn how to use React in a very robust way. Okay, so another concept about lifting state is that you don't it's not just about pieces of data like a string or an array of objects or things like that. Maybe some JSON that you're fetching from an API that you want to pass down. You can actually pass handlers as props by referencing the handler functions as well. And that can be really handy when you have one component that has a button where something's being clicked, but you actually need other things to change as well in other components, especially if that's in the child component and not in the parent, because other ways it's like, how do you notify something in the parent from the child? And the way to do that is to actually have your handler be in the parent and pass it down as a prop so that the child has access to it. So the user's interacting with some sort of element in your child. You can pass that handler down using a prop, and it essentially makes it an alias. Whatever you call the prop is how you're going to use that to call that function that's actually defined in the parent. So the handler in the parent will update the state that's held at that high level. And then the handler that's tied to the event that happens in the child, it's detected on something the user's interacting with in the child component, it'll just call that using that alias, and then it goes from there. So let's go see how this is going to work. And I'll explain it first by taking a look at our application as it currently stands. Right now, you're looking at this, and we've got available plants. We've got our selected plant instances over here in the flower bud, and available plants and flower bud are all children of main, right? And we can see this if we look at our components with the React Dev Tools here. We can see this structure. Available plants and flower bed are part of main. Selected plant is down here. And we have different things that are going to be affected by clicking on these buttons, and they're all not necessarily in this component. And we need this data that's being, all of these plants that we're going to go fetch. We need them to be available all the way down to the available plant components that we have multiple instances of here, and the selected plant components that we have multiple instances of here. So the ideal would be to manage that state up here in main, so that we can pass the plants down to available plant and then pass it down to flower bed and then certain selected plants there through flower bed, right? So that's going to be where we want to maintain the state. So that means if we click on a button in available plant here, we're going to have handlers up here in main that are going to change that state, and then everything should cascade down and re-render from there. Okay. So that's what we're going to work toward. So let's see, I've got some to-dos that I need to clear up here. Give me a second. Oh, we did have one more thing. Conditional styling. I mentioned to you in the previous lecture that we could actually use conditional syntax to affect our styling. That is one more thing I wanted to do in the flower bed. So let me do this real fast, and then we will go get started on working on our handlers and our state for the plants. So let me take a look here. Yes. Okay. We currently have this where when we go into this form, everything pretty much looks the same. Maybe it would be nice for it to be a little more obvious that we're not currently working with this, and this edit button is not actually active. We want to just focus on the form here while the form is open, and then when this closes it, this will come back and look like this again. We can do that with conditional rendering. And so I'm going to just do some inline styling right here and say that for my div that's holding both the name of the flower bed and the edit button, I'm going to affect how it looks by changing its opacity. So I'm going to just add right here after the class name, I'm going to add another, let's see, let's do it this way. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to add another attribute, style, and then I'm going to give it an expression to evaluate here to decide what the style should be. So we'll say, are we editing? And I'll use a ternary expression and say, if we're editing, then I want you to set the opacity to 0.4, 40%. Otherwise, I want you to set the opacity to 1. Notice that with React, we actually have to provide it here, the actual object, the CSS object that we want to provide here, not just the key value pair, which is what you would do if you were doing this with regular HTML. So that's what's happening here. We're saying, are we editing? If so, here's some CSS I want you to apply to this div. Otherwise, this is the CSS I want you to apply to the div. So it's either got full opacity or it's only 40%. The other thing we can do here is, nope. Oh, yes. We also can add some conditional styling. I'm like arguing with myself in my head. Sorry, guys. Okay. Right here on the button, I can also disable this if I want to. There's new opinions on whether using the disabled, the built-in disabled attribute on a button is a good idea for accessibility purposes. But I'm going to show you what this looks like because you're probably going to see it out there. If you wanted to just disable the button entirely, you could add this and say that that should be true or false based on whether editing is true or false. So if we're editing, it shouldn't be, no, it should be. And if we're not editing, it should not be. So that's how we control that. Okay, so that's two different things. Let's come over here and see it in action. As soon as I hit edit, and we changed the value of editing to false, or sorry, to true, then you'll notice that the opacity here is 40%, and I can click on this, but nothing happens. And now when we save it, it changes back. Okay, that's conditional styling. All right, now we got that one out of the way. Let's go back to our previously scheduled programming. We are going to go to to-do number 9. All right. So we are going to first, we're going to start working with the state variable we created here. We created it earlier just as an example. Now we're ready to use it. So let's say we want to have a handler that will allow it to be updated whenever we allocate or return plants. So we're going to start getting serious about making these buttons, these little icons, functional now. So I will start by writing a handler. Lost my place. Here we go. Okay. I'm going to write a handler that will handle the return of plants. And also write a handler that's going to handle the allocation of plants. I need to make this const. There we go. Handle return. I'm just going to call it handle return, give it a slightly different name than we used before. I'm going to call this the plant instead of plant because we need to be very clear what we're working with. There are some tricky things about updating something with state when you're working with something like an object. And remember, our data, everything is stored in objects. And the numbers that we're actually going to be updating are these numbers right here that are values of keys within that object. Because of that, we need to essentially update the entire object. But we're only really interested in doing one of these or two of these at a time, and the rest should just stay the same. So we're going to have to use some special syntax to do that. So just bear with me. We are going to handle allocate and say if the plant dot num avail nope, I don't want to do that yet. Sorry, give me a second. That's to-do number 18. We're going to make this a little simpler. We're going to just update some plants. And ultimately what we want to do is set all plants. We're going to call our setter and pass in some updated plants. So we need to establish what those updated plants are. because we're just going to overwrite it entirely, the entire all plants thing. So updated plants is going to be a new array where we're going to map over all plants as it currently exists. And this is why I needed to do the plant versus a plant, because when we're working with all plants, we want to call each one of those a plant. But then when we're working with the plant is referring to the actual plant that we're updating right now, whenever we click on one of the buttons for one of the plants, because we have multiple plants. And all of these different objects that exist over here, and we need to be specific about which one it is that we're updating if we have to update the entire list. So that's the plant. And then this is just looking at one plant at a time from this entire thing. So we'll call that a plant. And we'll check to see if the ID is the same. If a plant dot ID is not equal to the plant ID, and I'm going to do this on multiple lines here. So if that's true, then we can just give it the plant and let it just go ahead and add the plant that was already there because we're not making any changes to it. But if it isn't, we need to actually give it a new object. And one of the things that you learned about previously here was this idea of having the spread operator to be able to add a bunch of things at once to an array or to an object. We're going to do that here and say, I want you to just go get everything from the plant as it existed in all plants and add those. But there's a couple of them that I would like to update specifically. And then you can name those and it will actually change the values of just these. So we'll say we want the num available to be whatever it was before plus 1. And we want num allocated to be whatever it was before in all plants minus 1. And that's going to allow us to move it from available to allocated. So that's that. And each one of these, as it goes through all plants and looks at these, it's going to give updated plants a new element that's either the original plant, because that's not the one we're interested in, or if it is the one we're interested in because they have the same ID, we're going to give it a new element altogether that has all the values from before, except the ones we want to change. And we can just set new values for those here. And then once it goes through and it does that for every single one and it maps over and provides a brand new array, that's the array that we want to use to overwrite the original all plants variable in state. And now we have a whole new list of plants where only the one that actually was the ID we're interested in. And that means we're going to have to pass this in. So you remember before I said that we were going to get to a point where we actually needed to know how to have a handler and place it on an element where we could provide an argument for it because there's a parameter. This is that time. So we're going to need to have an anonymous function definition to do that for us. We'll get to that in just a second. Okay, so that's our first one. Our second one is going to look really similar. It's just the opposite, right? If we're allocating a plant, the values are going to go the opposite direction. So I'm going to call this one handle allocate. And we're going to look for the specific plant we're trying to match. And then here we're going to just switch it to where we're subtracting one from available and adding one to allocated. Okay. Otherwise, it's the exact same process where we're just updating all plants with all the plants and with that one plant having those new values. Okay. So that was to-do number 9. Let's see what we need to do next. To-do number 10 is where we're going to add props to available plant so that we can pass these handlers down. Because right now in available plant, we have some handlers here, but they're not going to be able to do much for us because the all plants is actually going to be stored at the parent level. So we just need to get rid of these altogether, and we're going to use some props instead. So if I add the props on here, and let's just say we call it return plant, And that is where we're passing down the handle return function, and allocate plant, which is where we pass down handle allocate. We'll be able to use these as aliases by passing these down as props to call these functions. So now I can go and say I've got return plant and allocate plant over here in available plant. I want to, those are available to me now, so I can destructure those from props. So I'm going to do, let's see, I'm going to add this separately, and I'm going to say I want to destructure some things just from props. And so I can go get the plant, and then I can just change this to say I want to destructure all these properties out of plant, no problem. But then I also am going to go get return plant and allocate plant. And those are the aliases now for my handlers that are defined in the parent. That means I can call them using these names now that these are available here in this component. So right here where I have the on click, instead of saying handle return plant, which doesn't exist anymore, I'll say return plant because that's my alias for the handler in the parent. And I'll say allocate plant here. And now when we click on these icons, it's going to call these handlers that we define right up here because we passed them down. Okay, that's an important concept about being able to affect changes in the parent based on user interaction in the child. All right. So now that we have that in place, we should be able to see these numbers changing, I think. So let's go try it out. Is that working yet? Oh, hold on. Let me go over to the console. The other thing that I'd like to do here is to let's go ahead and put, when you write these handlers, really, the very first thing you should do is a console log just to make sure that it's catching it. So let's say I am returning the, and then we'll add on the plant. Oh, I didn't pass it in. That's why. Okay. See, this is why. We actually, we need to know what the plant is, right? So I'm going to say the plant dot name, was it? I think. Let's look at our data. Name, yes. I am returning the whatever. Okay. So in order to know what the plant is, we have to pass it in. So again, this is where I can't just reference this if I need to be able to specify what the plant is. So instead, I'm going to create an anonymous function that calls return plant and allows me to pass in the plant like this. And we'll do the same thing here and say, here's an anonymous function definition. And whenever you detect that click, call allocate plant and pass the plant along. Okay. And then I could put something very similar here. And handle allocate, I am allocating the plant. Okay, let's try it out. There we go. Let me clear this. Okay, I'm allocating the hyacinth. I'm allocating the tulip. I am returning the daffodil. I'm returning the tulip. So we can see that these are firing now. The only thing is we don't see anything changing here with these numbers, right? It's because the JSX is not being built yet from all plants. It's being built from test plants. And all plants is the one being updated, right? So if we update this to actually be working with all plants, and that's the data that it's sending to the all plants, to the available plant, each one of these instances of this, now we're mapping over the correct data, the one that's being updated, and then we should see the changes. Okay. So now as I change this, you can see these values going down and up, right? As I'm doing this. Now, we aren't changing anything over here yet. That's because we have some work to do in flower bed in order to be able to pass that down. Similarly, we're going to have to make sure we're passing down all plants instead of the test plants to make that possible. So let's actually just go do that. I think that's probably the very next thing that we're supposed to do. I don't see an 11. Okay, there's a 12. Let's do. Make sure selected plants is using all plants. There we go. Okay, so if we pass down all plants now, to where it's actually paying attention to the state variable, React's going to say, oh, so I should re-render the selected plant instances, each of these components. If that plant changes, if any of the data in that plant changes, I should update that. So now when we click the buttons, we see that not only is this hyacinth coming down in terms of the availability, this one is going up, and vice versa, right? So we're seeing this dynamically updating in both places, and that's because the state is held at the parent and it's being passed down through these props. All right, who has questions about what I've done so far? And it's totally okay if you're like, I have so many questions. Just ask the first ones that come to mind.
Sorry, it might be too many questions to pick one.
Yes, that's totally normal. That'd be okay. Okay, I know it's a lot. Yeah. The main thing to remember here is that state is what allows React to track changes and to actually consider re-rendering the page if it changes. That's the main takeaway here. And because we're changing these numbers in here, that's going to cause it to update the page. And that's exactly why we're seeing these numbers change here and here. All we have to do is change the data in the objects in the array, and everything else flows from there. It just cascades down. So these are the fundamentals of React that make it possible for it to make those quick, rapid, very efficient partial changes by using the virtual DOM and then updating the actual DOM in the browser. Okay. So that's that. Let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about use effect, and we'll look at how it's possible to actually fetch data from an API and use that data, but make sure that we hook into the life cycles of the page so that the data, the page does not try to render data that doesn't yet exist because it hasn't been received. Because as we remember, we're using promises with fetch, right? Because we don't know how long it's going to take for the data to come to us. So we're going to deal with all of that when we get back from the break. One of the things I would like to stress before I talk about use effect is that you do not need to know use effect for your graded assignment, for graded assignment number 6. But you will need to use it for those of you who work on the front end of your full stack application for liftoff when you do your capstone project. So I wanted to make sure to teach it now so that you have something to refer to when it comes time to, work on that application where you're going to need to do more complex things like fetching data from an external API. And I also just want to encourage you, even some of the things that I just did where I was, updating those objects in that array with this, use state and all of that. That's also more complex than what you need for your graded assignment. So, but it also is in keeping with what you're going to need to know for liftoff. So I'm trying to help bridge that gap for you a little bit so that you guys are going to have a limited amount of time to get your projects done. And I want to make sure that you have good examples to work with when it comes time to do the more advanced things like fetching from an API and updating full objects with multiple properties and things like that. So don't stress about today's studio or your graded assignment number 6. It will not be this complex. You won't need to know that until a little bit later. Okay. So let's talk about use effect. This is a second hook built into React that listens for changes in state. And this will allow you to have additional functionality that you might want to specify some code that runs anytime state changes, and not just have it, re-render for you. Maybe you want to do more. There are 2 arguments for this. A function that should be executed whenever that change is detected, and then an array that has 1 or more state variables to monitor. So it's going to pay attention and say, hey, has the state changed of that state variable? If so, I'll execute this function that you just gave me. So here's an example. Let's say we have items. Items is a state variable. So we would need to set up use effect, and that second argument, we would put items in that array and say, here's the thing that I want you to listen for. And then you would have some sort of function that you want to execute. And most of the time, that's included as a definition, just an anonymous function. And then you just put the code to be executed in it. So it sets it up very similarly to, it's the same concept of as an event listener, which you've done before, where you're just saying, I've got a function, hang on to it. And when the time comes, you can run it. So using an anonymous function in place like this is perfectly fine. But if you have something that is maybe defined elsewhere, then you would just give the name of it here and just refer to it, right? So that's the basic concept here. And let's talk about it specifically in terms of what would happen if you wanted to use effect just to run something the very first time the component mounts. So when that component mounts and it is going to insert itself into the DOM for the very first time, you would just use an empty array as that second argument instead of giving it a state variable to listen to. But don't leave it off unless you want it to run every single time the page re-renders. And sometimes that is what you want. But in this case, if you only want it to execute at the very beginning, just give it an empty array. So this concept here is very important for fetching data because you're probably going to want to have some way to decide whether you are going to allow the page to load or not, and actually display and render for the user. And you can use conditional rendering to do that, right? So let's say you're tracking your data in state and you have a state variable for that. You might set up some sort of fetching process to go fetch your data. And you're just going to have a use effect that says the very first time the component renders, so you give it an empty array to indicate that, go run this fetch function. I don't need you to run it after that, just the first time. And so then all the code to fetch that JSON and set, call the setter to set the data and all of that, you can put that inside that function. But it should only run it the very first time the component mounts when you give it an empty array like this, and that's going to work. And then, of course, the second step would be to actually have some sort of additional state variable that's tracking. It's a Boolean to track whether you're still loading or you're done loading. And we'll do that example of that in just a minute. So again, this empty array is the key here to telling it that you only want it to run at the very beginning. And then this is the function that you want to execute at that point. All right, let's go make our app fully functional here with fetched data. So I'm going to head on over to to-do number 13. And we are going to write an asynchronous function that's going to allow us to fetch JSON and set it into all plants. And that's going to be this JSON here that I've got in this Google Doc. Let's go ahead and get this up. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and write this here. Make sure I've got what I need. Good. Okay. So we'll say fetch plants. Remember that when you use modern syntax for fetching, you need to make it an asynchronous function, right? So we'll use async before we give the empty, no parameters there. So we'll just have the empty parentheses to represent that. And then inside here, we will set a response. And that's going to be await. We're going to await the fetch. And then we'll have the data that we're capturing once it comes back. And that's where we await the unboxing of the response with the JSON method. Okay, so that's the basic structure of this, if you remember, back when we were looking at this in previous chapters. So here I just need to give it the URL that it's meant to fetch from. And this is where I need, this URL that's formed up from Google Drive, where you go to docs.google.com/document/D, and then you give it the ID of your document, and then /export. And then you have a query parameter here, format equals text, so that it knows to just treat it like plain text and bring it in. And then it can actually use this JSON method here to parse it properly. And then you'll have your JSON set in this data variable. Okay, then once you have it, you have to do something with it, right? And this is where we need to actually map over the JSON and set it into some plant data. And so I'm going to create a variable called plant data to do that. This is going to be the result of our mapping. So I'm going to say for every single object that's in the JSON, which I've called data, let's go through here and return a new object to set into our new array. And we're going to have, object.id, and we could have, object.name, and set the color, object.color, et cetera, right? We have image URL, which is object.image. We'll give them all the exact same names. And num available, you may not have noticed this because I've kind of only brought it up a couple of times, but the data is never going to have, if it's just coming as starting data, it's not going to have allocated. It only has the num available. So we just want to default our num allocated property that we need to be 0, because that's not actually coming from the JSON. We're just saying when we start out, we're not allocating anything. So we're just going to do it this way. Okay. So I'll return that and for each one. And now we have plant data that's a whole array of objects that has all the information we need that came out from the JSON plus this initial value of 0 for allocated for each of the plants. The second thing that I have here under this is to alphabetize them. I actually, you may recall in the utils file here, I have a function for that that's being exported. So I can come over to here and actually say I want to import, and I'm going to destructure, alphabetize from shared utils. And now I can make use of that here and say alphabetize. Oh my goodness. Okay. Alphabetize, and I'll give it plant data. So the way I wrote alphabetize, if you saw this, is to give it the array and also tell it which one of the keys in the object it should alphabetize on. So I'm going to say go alphabetize this plant data that I just created, and I want it alphabetized based on the name. Okay. And then I can set my state variable with set all plants and give it plant data. And now instead of test plants here, we really should just say we're starting out with an empty array until we actually receive the fetched data. And that means we don't need test plants anymore. We're done. We are at a point of development of this application that we don't need to have dummy data anymore. We have real data we can work with that we're fetching from this API. This is always an exciting point in the development process of something like this, is when you start using the real data. Okay, so we have fetch, but we have not called it, right? So fetching is not going to happen unless we are aware that all plants has been set for the very first time. Sorry, no. Let me re-say that. Give me just a second. We can't call fetch plants unless we're doing it with useEffect. Because we need to be able to hook into the life cycle right when that component is first mounting. So we'll do that and set this to run useEffect right at the point of mounting. When I tabbed over just then, you'll notice it added it here in the destructured things that are coming from React, these functions that are coming out of React. So it's been imported now and I can use it. 2 arguments, right? First is a function. So I'll just say call fetch plants whenever you're ready, and I'll give it that anonymous function to do that. And then I'll give it the empty array to indicate that I want it to run only when the component first mounts. Okay, that should work, I think. I may need to reformat that, but that should work. Okay. So let's go see if we are getting it. And something I can do here also is, another good idea when you're fetching for the very first time and you want to make sure that your data is coming in is, of course, to console log it. So let's just log our data and make sure that it's coming in as we expect. And we can come over here and look at the page. And sure enough, there it is. However, the page is broken. You see that? And the reason for that is that idea of a race condition where our page was loading and trying to render before the data had arrived, because it takes a minute, well, it doesn't take a minute. It takes a few milliseconds for the data to arrive from the server, wherever Google Drive is, off where it's stored this stuff. So the data is definitely here now, but it came in just a little too late for the page to render. That's why we need to pay attention to this and actually have another use effect that's looking for when all plants is going to update with this and it's no longer an empty array. And that's when we'll know that it's okay to load the page. And then we won't have this anymore. So we definitely have the data, no problem. Let's take care of making sure that the page does not render until the data is in place. So we're going to need another variable right here, another state variable just to track the status of loading, and we're going to call it loading. And we'll have a setter called set loading, and we'll use state and set it to true because we want to assume that we are loading until we have the data, and then we'll set it to false. Okay, so that's done. Now we need to conditionally render the page. So down here where we return our JSX at the very bottom of the component, we need to prevent it from rendering. And I feel like I'm skipping some to-dos. So hang on just a second. Yeah, let's go ahead and do the use effect because it's not going to actually work unless we have this in place. Okay. So this is going to be the first type of use effect I showed you where you actually are listening for a state variable specifically. And it can happen at any time after the component has mounted, not when it first mounts. And so in order to indicate that, the second argument here needs to be the array with all plants in it, so that we can say, this is what we want you to pay attention to. And then once you find that this has changed, the value that this has changed from its initial value of empty array, then that is when you should actually load the page, and it will change the value of loading. So if all plants dot length is greater than 0, and that's just to verify that the data actually has something in it, it's not just an empty array, we'll set loading to false. And then we can do our conditional rendering. Now, nothing has changed yet because we haven't actually used loading. So let's come down here to the JSX. This is the part, yes, number 17. Prevent the page from rendering until the data has been fetched using that loading state variable. So we will say, as long as we are no longer loading, then you can go ahead and render this. And I'm just going to use the double ampersand here. I don't really need to have I'm choosing not to have any sort of alternative, but some people, you go to websites sometimes and maybe it's taking a second to load and you'll see some sort of spinner in the middle of the page, or it might just say, please wait, still loading data or something, right? So you could do that with a ternary expression if you wanted to and have some sort of alternate thing. But I'm just going to go ahead and do it this way for now. It's going to happen so fast that we're barely going to see it. We're barely going to notice, but it's just enough to keep it from breaking the page because it is going to wait to render until that data has come in. So let's refresh, and looks like we still have an issue. So let's see what's going on here. Use effect must not return anything beside a function. Okay, yeah. The way that this is formatted is causing a problem. So let me actually do it like this. There we go. All right. So in this case, it was requiring me to actually put it in the brackets, which is fine. So I use the brackets and put that in there. And now it's recognizing this as a function definition, this anonymous function. And that was what it was complaining about. Okay. So we see our data and look at that. We have a lot more flowers now because we're not just working with dummy data anymore. And we notice that the num allocated is 0 for all of them because that's how we set it up. And we have the full amount available here. And it's only when I actually start using these that we see them start to change. Now, there are some improvements we can make to the page here. Before I make those improvements, however, does anybody have any questions about the use effect things that I just did?
Not seeing any.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So one to fetch, one to indicate that it's okay to load the page. But while that's all working and we see our data, the reason that I kind of waited and saved a lot of this until last is because there's this concept that you may have heard me mention before, and you're going to hear it a lot, especially if you decide you want to work in front end development, and that's user experience. And it has everything to do with making sure that your user has a really smooth time and doesn't notice any weird little idiosyncrasies or glitches or something that just doesn't make sense. And one of those would be this whole thing of saying, I'm going to keep pulling these plants back, or I'm going to allocate them to the point where I start going into the negative numbers. It doesn't make any sense, right? It also might be useful not to have any flowers over here unless they've actually been allocated. It's not necessarily useful to show them all and just have zeros on them. So what if we wanted to actually filter this so that it only includes the cards here for flowers that have been allocated, and it leaves them off entirely if they haven't? All of these things work together to make for a much smoother experience, different visual cues. So we could also make it possible to where when we've allocated all of the flowers available, that this entire thing turns gray and it makes it really obvious that there are no more of those available, right? And we can prevent these from going down into the negative or going too far in the positive direction. So let's go ahead and start making some changes and just, you know, tiny little tweaks here and there to improve the user experience. These are things you want to think about when you're planning out and, developing your page for sure. Okay, let's go back to our to-dos because I want to get these in the right order. Okay. Number 18, make sure that they update only if the plants are still available to return or allocate. This is to prevent those negative numbers or the numbers that are getting higher than they should be, right? So let's go ahead and do that. And so we're going to need to do that up here in our handlers. I'm losing track of where I am. Here we go. Up here in our handlers. So I'm going to add a little bit of logic to just check whether there's actually some that are still available or not. I'm going to get rid of my console logs here because we're done with that. I'm going to say if the plant in question that has been passed in, and we're saying this is the one we're trying to update, if the plant dot num allocated is greater than 0, then we can in fact allocate one, right? Then we can return one is what I mean. Yeah. Okay. And then I'm going to take all of that and say, we're only going to execute this code if that's true. So I'm just going to move it on up right there. And then we'll do the exact opposite here and say, if the plant dot num available is greater than 0, then we do in fact have some that we can allocate. And so we'll only allow this code to execute if that's true. All right, let's go test it out. Now, let's go to one that's small. Okay, purple irises. We have 4 available. I can allocate all 4 of those, and as soon as I get to where this is 0, it no longer lets me do any more. I can click this to my heart's content and nothing is going to change because I put that logic in there to prevent it from happening. That makes a lot more sense now, right? Okay, so that was number 18. Let's do number 19. All right, let's filter the plants so that only the plants with allocations actually are included here. We can do this in place right here. We can actually say, let's take all plants. We want to send down only the ones that actually have a number of allocations greater than 0. So I can just say, this is another one of those higher order functions that's built into JavaScript. And we could say, look at each plant and see if the num allocated property is greater than 0 for that plant. And if it is, include it in the array that's passed down. So this entire thing returns a new array that's filtered. So if we come back over here now, we see we have an empty array when this thing first loads, right? We have nothing allocated. And because, the application reset, right? And so we had, the last time we worked on this, we had already, set this to display conditionally this text, select a plant to get started if it received an empty array. So this makes a lot of sense. And as soon as I start allocating things, they start showing up. And I could like do a few here, I can come down here, maybe do some of these. And then if I start taking some of those out, we see it disappear. So React is paying attention again, because all plants is a state variable. It's paying attention to any of those changes. And every time we change the value, it re-renders accordingly. And we see all of these little tiny changes happening in real time, which is great. And it's, you guys are pretty accustomed these days to seeing apps that work this way. They're built on, frameworks and libraries like React. A lot of them are built on React. Netflix is built on React. React was devised by Facebook, by Meta. So, they use it for a lot of their stuff. So you get a lot of really cool user-friendly interfaces with these changes because React is able to do this so efficiently. Okay, last one. We want over here an available plant to add an unavailable class that is going to make it kind of gray out whenever more plants are available. And if we look at the CSS here to see what's going on, we can look at unavailable. It's probably going to be at the end. Yeah, we're setting a filter of grayscale at 100% and the opacity at 60%. And so we're just going to conditionally apply this class to any available plant that has no more plants available to allocate. So I can go to the very top level here of the div that encloses everything on that available plant card. And I'm going to add an additional class. Oh, I'm sorry. I need to do it inside here. Okay. So I need to change this. Right now, this is just a hard-coded string. I need to update it and make it a template literal so that I can put some JavaScript in there. Here we go. All right. And of course, we said that if you use template literals with JSX, you have to put them in a placeholder. So we'll make sure the template literal is inside a JSX placeholder, and then inside the template literal itself, we use JavaScript placeholders to evaluate our condition. So we'll say if num available is 0, then we want to add the class unavailable. And that's that shorthand there where we use the AND logical operator to indicate if this is true, then we should add this. Otherwise, it just doesn't get added. So it will add these two classes for sure. And then this one, maybe it adds it, maybe it doesn't, depending on whether num available that's been destructured here from plant is 0 or not. So now we'll come over here and test it out. Let's use our irises. All right, as soon as I got to 0, notice the entire thing is grayscale and it's kind of a lower opacity. And I can do the same thing with some of these, allocate. And of course, this one, these have larger numbers, but you get the idea, right? You could see immediately. That's a great thing for user experience. It makes it really obvious which ones are still available or not, because this is kind of visually marked as unavailable. So these are the kinds of things you can think about when you're a front-end developer, ways that you can make your page even more user-friendly, make it faster for your user to visually kind of sort things out and think things through on your page. and make it interactive and fun and visually engaging. Any last questions about anything before I wrap up?
Yeah, we got one.
Really sure how to go.
So is publishing a React page the same as like publishing your assignment through GitHub? Is
No.
that
No, you'd have to actually deploy a React application. Yeah, deployment's not something that's within the scope of this course. But it's something that a lot of people choose to do with their capstone projects after they get those up and running. And you certainly could get something like this up and running. The main thing to remember is that as long as you don't have a back end, you don't have any sort of database saving changes, when the application starts over, it's just going to be back to zero again. Like as soon as I hit refresh, we're back to zero. And that's okay, because if you're just intending it to be a demo of what you can do, no problem. So, I mean, and that would be the same as the way you're doing it with some of your, vanilla JavaScript things that you did in the DOM. But yeah, to deploy it on, I mean, you can look into it. There's a lot of resources out there for people who want to deploy just simple React apps to using GitHub. There's just some extra steps involved. Any other questions?
looking like that might cover us?
Yeah. Okay. All right. I know we covered a lot today. Because React is a lot. That's why we take 3 classes to introduce it. But this third one's a little bit of a doozy, especially with use effect included. But again, I will reiterate: don't worry about use effect for your graded assignment. You can worry about that when you get to your capstone project at the end of Unit 2. All right. I do, in fact, have a practice exercise for the concepts we talked about today, using use state and the idea of lifting your state and passing handlers through props. So if you want to get practice on the basics of that and just using props and handlers, this little Healthy Habits app allows you to build a quick little app for tracking things like your water intake and the number of steps you've done and what food you've eaten and the calories consumed and your exercise, and it'll update this dynamically as you're filling in your little forms here at the bottom. It's a helpful little thing. So there's full instructions on the README. I don't think I have a video for this one. It was something I did as a TA for a small group of students that were learning React like for their Unit 2 instead of learning a backend technology like Java or C#. So yeah, so there's no video for this one, but it has very, very, very clear instructions in the README. For Studio today, you are going to kind of continue this theme of like a Pinterest board where you're going to do a few things on a page, practice using state, the use state hook, and some handlers to update content on the page dynamically. And just remember to keep practicing making small Git commits along the way. And that will be a good little exercise for practice that will help prepare you for graded assignment 6.